a member of Gitawag and Nachi ceremonial communities within the Cherokee Nation. And my work is grounded within archives and language reclamation work, as well as versioning fields of play and role-playing game studies. I'm going to do a quick acknowledgement before I hand over the introductions. Come gasa no janeha ale osker ogila sa'i otni jun denalad ani yawia junika yelage uni jelikoi junena sa'i jinos dane jigoshaha gandan UMD kalalat jundes pas ani nakashtan kanikiskata weno ale dunda dudala ani yawia na gesa Idinigo hila Elohe la hesco la yehi na yehi aniyawi yastahi. Today, members of the Center for Archival Futures at the University of Maryland are meeting from College Park, located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacoshnonk, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, land-grant university, we acknowledge that 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which includes archival collecting, generates between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We further acknowledge the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations, and celebrate the collaborative and decolonial work now taking place within archival collections and institutions, and in work more broadly. As a reminder, we have and will always be on Indigenous land.
Thank you, Ia, for leading us in the land acknowledgement. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Angela Rogers-Kukui, the new Associate Director of Outreach, Engagement, and Inclusion for Center for Archival Futures, which is part of the Info School here at UMD. I am excited and thrilled that we are here for our virtual event for our Spring First Wednesday Cafe series, featuring two outstanding speakers who will discuss a topic of imagining decolonial archival futures. At Cafe, our mission is to develop, disseminate human-centered approaches to creating archival systems and processes. We conduct research education and partnership building to advance this mission. We would like to express our gratitude to our Cafe leadership team, including Director Victoria Van Heining, Associate Director Jessica Grimer, Arts, she's the Associate of Arts and Culture Initiatives with Cafe, our past Director Katrina Felon, and Diana Marsh for their dedication in their leadership. Next, we will have Lydia to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Curlis. I am a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Maryland iSchool, and it is with great pleasure today that I get to introduce our two very wonderful speakers that I'm so excited to have. So our first speaker, Krista McCracken, they, them pronouns, is an award-winning public historian and archivist. They work as a researcher curator at Algoma University, Arthur A. Weishart Library, in Shingawak Residential School Center in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe and Métis people. Krista's research focuses on community archives, residential schools, access, and outreach. In 2020, they won the Best Article in Indigenous History Prize awarded by the Canadian Historical Association's Indigenous History Group for their article, Challenging Colonial Spaces, Reconciliation and Decolonizing Work in Canada's Archives. Our second speaker, Skylee-Storm Hogan-Stacey, they, them pronouns, is a historian, author, and research analyst currently living and working on the unceded territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Ottawa, Ontario. A descendant of the Mohawk Nation of Ganawage, Skylee-Storm has explored community archival practices, Indigenous archival access, residential school history, Indigenous Crown legal history, and oral history. Since 2019, Skylee-Storm has worked with No History Historical Services as a research historian in their Ottawa office. Skylee-Storm began their work unpacking and understanding Indigenous archives when they joined the Shingawak Residential School Center in 2015. They have remained a collaborator with the center on projects related to the community archives and site history. Skylee-Storm completed a rewrite on the Ontario Provincial Heritage Program plaque for Shingawak Hall in 2022. After working with Shingawak Residential School Center, Skylee-Storm has become an advocate for critiquing archival power dynamics and settler Canadian historical narratives. Their book, Decolonial Archival Futures, continues this work and will be what they are presenting on today. So without further ado, I will pass it on.
Just going to short out the screen share if you want to introduce or start, Storm.
Sure. So thank you so much for those introductions. We really appreciate being invited here today to speak with you. So as you know, this is a cafe for a Center for Archival Futures. We're going to be talking a little bit about imagining decolonial archival futures and a little bit about what all of those things mean, because it's a many faceted, complicated thing. Because as we're going to get into, archives aren't exactly straightforward when it comes to decolonial archival practice. To situate myself, like in my bio, I am working and living on the unceded, unsurrendered, stolen territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And to explain my positionality, I was also a guest on the lands of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, where I did a lot of this learning from the children of Shingwak Alumni Association, who are survivors of the former Shingwak Residential School on that site. So I was a guest in the lands of the Oji Cree, the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Métis people. And just to also acknowledge my family. So my father was born in the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, and his family still lives and resides there. My mom is a settler, and her family originally comes from Ireland at some point. They came to Newfoundland, and then they came to what we now know as Toronto, Ontario. So while, you know, the government considers me an enrolled member of the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, my community process is matrilineal, so I consider myself a descendant and ally to my ancestors and my family and my friends there. So I'll pass it over to you, to Krista.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for that warm welcome today. So just to position myself, I live and work in Sault Ste. Marie, also known as Bawating, the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe and Métis people, specifically Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the historic Métis community of Sault Ste. Marie. I think it's really important for me to acknowledge that I'm a settler in this work, but also to acknowledge that so much of my learning and the work that I do is building on and working with the Children of Shingwak Alumni Association and survivors of the Shingwak Residential School specifically. We'll definitely talk more about them today, but really wanting to start off with that acknowledgement of the work that survivors of the Shingwak Residential School have been doing since the 1980s. So we're going to start off by just providing a little bit of context to our talk. And this is probably not new information for folks who are joining today, but really just wanting to acknowledge that archives are part of the colonial system, part of the colonial state, and really many, particularly national archives, were set up as mechanisms of the state that legitimize the state, document particular types of history and heritage, and often archives are recording the lives of Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations for state-driven purposes, not for reasons that potentially the community or nation wants. And sometimes that information is recorded without consent, quite often without consent. And there's a lot of structures involved in archival practices that are embedded in colonial ways of thinking and systems of knowledge that do not necessarily align with Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, because that's the system that folks are coming up against when they visit an archive. But it's also the system that the work Skylee-Storm and I do tries to break down and blow up a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where we try to explain that how we organize our information and how we attribute who owns information, how it's collected, and for what purpose is often rooted in, well, not often, it's always rooted in settler colonialism, especially in the Canadian context. Records about Indigenous people at Library and Archives Canada, which is our national archives, is the largest collection that they have. And you know, that's even after a large amount of it being destroyed at one point. And most of it is to essentially keep track of who is owed money, treaty rights, etc. So it's various types of information as well as health information. And the big part is that the access to this is very uneven, and it is always done usually without consent and applied with colonial laws about access to information and privacy that keeps the records out of hands of communities that the information is actually about. So to kind of get into that, decolonial archival practice is Indigenous-led. So I think that that's an important part of it. It can be a partnership, but I think it's really important to explore the power dynamics in partnerships, especially between university institutions, as well as, you know, government institutions or government granting bodies with certain reporting expectations, etc. I think that any Indigenous community should have the most power in that situation, especially when these items are about them or be repatriated to their own rights holding. So there's a willingness to listen because that whole process is not going to be easy. It's going to involve, you know, a lot of changing our practices, are the ways that we organize information, the way that we view information, the way that we provide access, policies, structures. So that comes into shifting power. So unfortunately, a lot of the issues that we're seeing in Canada comes from this unwillingness to hand over power or shift that power dynamic to the people who would be best poised to make changes in those institutions. Commitment to relationships. So we see a lot of grant-based relationships. We see a lot of short-term partnerships that usually involve a large sum of money. And then one that isn't in play anymore, oftentimes we see that those relationships are discarded, or they're not, you know, maintained between grants or maintained between exhibitions, etc. Policy and practice changes. So that means actual tangible change that's written into the fabric of the institution. So things that actually impact the day-to-day running, how people interact with it, and what the mandate is for the work, what the purpose is of the institution or the organization. And then understanding the archives differently. So really looking at the archives as not so much as a passive collection of things, of records, of data points and information that, you know, is no longer in daily use, something that is dead. I think that understanding the archives differently comes into viewing the archives as a living and tangible thing, especially when we're talking about records for communities that maybe have lost a lot of generations to residential or boarding schools, have had, you know, shifts in their land base. Archives can actually supplement some of that community oral knowledge. It's often going to tell a different story from a very different perspective. But understanding the archives as a tangible and living connection to the past, more than just a collection of documents, and something that has the power to transform, you know, community knowledge, community practice, and even into empowerment and activism within communities. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Krista.
I think the other piece I would add to that is that there's not going to be a one size fits all look at what decolonial archival practice is. And that's something we'll kind of touch on throughout our talk today. And what we're speaking from is based on our direct experience, and that might not work in certain circumstances. And I think acknowledging that how you opened this, Skylee, around Indigenous-led, I think is really important, because that's where that guidance is going to come from, and not me, for example, as a white archivist saying, this is how we're going to decolonize everything.
So when we were doing our work for imagining colonial archival future or decolonial archival futures, we really relied on looking at the work of UNDRIP and the Joint Ollenhager principles. I can never say it correctly. It's just one of those things for me. I can't. Even though I've been staring at this for months. We really wanted to place, this idea that Indigenous-led stewardship, communities having control, access, those types of things being the guiding framework. So articles of UNDRIP 11, 12, 13, and 31 relate to intellectual property. And these articles have direct ties to the intellectual property held within archives. So a lot of that comes down to who's the creator, who's the copyright holder, who's allowed to have access, as well as permit access or restrict access, who has rights to publish that information, reproduce that information, etc. These articles all assert that Indigenous peoples have the right to control and protect their intellectual property, which includes traditional culture. So this applies to archival materials as part of Indigenous people's cultural heritage. So a lot of times we see, old anthropology collections at universities, oftentimes, recordings of people speaking their languages, doing a language study, or studying dress or culture or traditions, sometimes even holding pieces, ceremonial pieces of material culture, remains, etc. So a lot of these things, should be under control and stewardship of Indigenous peoples rather than, the power of the colonial institution that came about it in a colonial way, often ignoring Indigenous rights, or in some cases abusing the rights of Indigenous peoples through exploitative sales, other policies.
And so in the book and kind of today, we've primarily looked at 4 colonial countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And part of this was these are the 4 countries that initially refused to sign on to UNDRIP. There's also a shared colonial past connected to these countries. And I think looking at the different archival and cultural frameworks and protocols that are in existence provides a really good lens to kind of talk about what has been done so far in certain countries, but how much more work there is to do as well. So like, for example, in the United States, you have like the protocols on Native American archival material. In Canada, the Steering Committee on Canada's Archives, in response to the report on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's task force, created a reconciliation framework. You've got protocols in Australia, and then in New Zealand, there's actually a legal framework. And I think looking at these different examples shows how implementation has sometimes worked, sometimes how it has failed, and hopefully hope for the future. But Skylee, do you want to chat a little bit about some of that framing that we've been thinking through?
Yeah, I think, there's been some success with implementing a framework or having people come together to kind of put together a framework. But we're in that phase right now where certain archives and other, institutions or organizations or partnerships are not really seeing how that frameworks can be implemented into our current legal structures, especially here in Canada, to use an example, because we have unfortunately very outdated access to information privacy laws in this country. So, you know, we wanted to figure out a way that other countries have approached it, look at things comparatively and say, you know, do we have to do this down to a colonial legal level, or are these things that we can do holistically, individually, nation to nation, or community based? A lot of the work that we have done has been community based, and really more so that grassroots type of work. But I think that, you know, being practical and understanding that not everything is going to become like a big legal framework, and we can do our best to implement it on the ground level, but without that institutional support or really the implementation, those frameworks start to get more difficult to implement on the ground level.
And I would say the other piece for folks who are starting to think about this work or maybe advocate for this work in their workplace is these frameworks are actually really good advocacy tools, particularly if they have been endorsed by your professional organization. Pointing to them as a wise practice is something that I think can be really useful.
And I know that they've been useful for us like on a granting level and otherwise. So like trying to get support at the government level or from granting bodies is really, you know, we have this framework. This is how we want to meet it. This is the things that it's going to support. And oftentimes institutions or universities specifically want to really look like they're coming into line with those types of frameworks, and it can help get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I think kind of continuing that. So the question I think that we quite often get is like, so where do I start? How do I actually put this into action? And so part of what I'm sharing is from my experience working in the Shingwak Residential School Center. And I think for me, part of this is understanding that this work is going to take a long time. It's actually work. It is not something that can be done off the side of somebody's desk. It needs to be made a priority. And part of that is because it is relationship building. It's relationship focused, and that takes energy, time, and effort. And it means being accountable to those relationships. And it also means acknowledging when you've done something wrong. So for me, when I first started working at the Shingwak Residential School Center, like it was the second job I got out of grad school. And I thought I knew lots about archives. And I remember Susie Jones, a survivor from Shingwak, sitting me down and very kindly telling me how wrong and how little I knew. And that changed my entire perspective on the type of work that I do, on how archives function, and the fact that some of the education I received in a formal, master's program wasn't preparing me to work in a community context. And that takes a lot of learning. It's sometimes trial and error, sometimes the error not so good. But I think that time piece is something that I would really emphasize.
Yeah, I kind of came from the opposite. So I started work in the Shingwak Residential School Center before pursuing an archives education and a public history education. So it kind of became this place being a mold for how other things should be done. But also to that listening piece is very important. And I know being a student at the time when I was working with the children of Shingwak, that's what actually taught me how to meaningfully listen, just because in classes, we were graded based on how many times we talked, because I was in a lot of debate style courses or participation based courses. So a lot of us were doing a lot of talking, but not a lot of listening. And I think that the survivors kind of taught me that was the big thing that I had to work on, which all of us in our early to mid 20s have to kind of work on that. But I think it's something that we're missing in a lot of other academic partnerships and situations, especially when we're thinking about power dynamics in archives. So when we're talking a bit about decolonial physical space, again, I did start off in my archives journey in this space. So I was very fortunate because we had, you know, a welcoming environment. It was usually myself and Krista, or maybe one other student who was employed there. And, you know, people could kind of just wander in. There was no appointment basis needed unless, you know, people wanted some research pulled. We had, you know, private to support reflection. So there are areas, as you can see in the photo at the front, where there are places to sit. There are also additional places to sit and movable walls, just in case people needed their own space. People were allowed to come as a family to look at records or to go through photographs. So there were things like smudge and tobacco and other things available nearby, just so that people had those things. There was access to cultural support services that we had a partnership with the local Survivor Support Society. There was no ID required, which a lot of archives, you know, even in universities, this was unique because you have to usually show your student ID and order it in some type of formal manner. That wasn't necessary in this space. So it was a really stark contrast between the spaces designed for state archives and spaces designed for community archives. Because when I started doing my work in Ottawa, as opposed to Sault Ste. Marie, I was going to a large building, you know, that is more than 5 stories tall, multiple levels. There's armed security guards. There's a check-in process where you have to show official ID. And that usually means something government issued. There was hovering, so a lot of the staff will walk the reading room and make sure you're not leaving the tops of boxes open, that your camera's being properly held in some type of tripod, there's not too much light, all of those little things that they kind of come around and tap you on the shoulder for. We didn't do that at Shingwalk. And, you know, people would reflect as they were looking at records. They would come to us and tell us about the things that they were finding, sometimes very personal things, sometimes things that brought up a lot of emotion. And as staff, you know, although we're not trained counselors or trained to do that type of work, we did take some support training. And we were, you know, always there to be emotionally present and listen. So that often meant putting aside our backlog tasks and going to go sit with people and listen about their relatives or look through photos with them, or hear stories about what they're going through with whatever research that they were doing. It was a very different space.
I think one of the things for me, this space, that emphasis on family and being able to come as a group is really important. And then also the fact that there's laughter in this space sometimes, and that like shushing is not a thing. I actually had a group probably a couple weeks ago in the archives here, and one of them turned to me and said, "Are we being too loud?" And I was like, "No, like laugh, do what you want. Like I'm not gonna shush you." And she's like, "Okay, because you can't shush an auntie." And I was like, "You're right. Like I can't." But I think the fact that it's a welcoming space is really important, and that staff are approachable. I'm not sitting behind my desk. I'm not judging what you're looking at. I'm just here to help. I think that is a really important part of the physical space. But beyond that, one of the things that the Shingwalk Residential School Center has actively been thinking through is, how are we organizing material? And I think anybody who's doing decolonial archival work is thinking through the archival processes that impact how content is accessed. And in the case of decolonial provenance, there's many different ways that this can be approached. It could be co-creatorship, it could be parallel provenance, societal-based provenance, and it could mean, you know, having different intellectual access points to collections, and many archives do that already. But why is this important? I mean, I think intellectually we can understand it's important, but I want to provide like a concrete example. When I first started working at the Shingwak Residential School Center, there was a collection that was known as the Principals Collection, and it was organized into series. There was maybe 8 series or so, and it was after each of the individual principals who were at the Shingwak Residential School. And the idea was that all the photos that had been collected related to a certain principal's time period would be located in that series, which makes sense. Like, they were findable. If you knew who the principal was at that time, you could look them up. The challenge being, particularly for survivors and families, was principals caused a lot of harm. They were perpetrators of abuse in the residential school system. And every time survivors were coming to the archive, if they wanted to find photos related to their time at the residential school, they needed to know the name of the principal, which not all of them knew that. But then also being confronted with that name over and over. And that's perpetrating harm while accessing those records. So how those records are organized now is they're organized by decade. And so folks just need to know approximate decade that they were at the Shingwak school, and we can pull them for them. They don't have to know who the principal was. There's a note saying that these were previously known as the principal's collection and the series titles. But those names aren't everywhere. And this is really listening to feedback from survivors, the Children of Shingwak Alumni Association, and the people who were having to access these photos and be confronted with things that weren't safe for them. Do you have anything you want to share on that one, Skylee?
Yeah, because I think, you know, in this particular example, I think that was something you undertook after speaking with the Children of Shingwak, because the people who set up this system, you know, well-meaning, decades previous, they were looking at the system a little bit differently, I think, than what the community and the survivors were looking for themselves. So it was really that listening piece that actually made the records more relevant and of better use to the community. Instead of, you know, what makes more sense to a non-Indigenous archivist or somebody deciding an arrangement for kind of loose photographs and different items that ended up in the room. And that kind of brings us to decolonial description. So I know a lot of folks are familiar with reparative description, redescription, those types of things. And, you know, unfortunately, we still get the people who say, like, you know, what does this do? Or why is this important? Or why should this happen? Or is this a use of our time? I think, you know, redescription does go only so far. You can have somebody going through and renaming photographs and keeping, you know, maybe the old name in the metadata for some accountability, or in the description for some accountability. But at the same time, participatory and community-based description really takes things to another level. We've seen a huge difference when we reach out to the community and ask them, you know, how would you describe these records? What would you say is going on in this photograph, from someone who is actually there or might be related to the people in the photograph. There's a lot more that adds to that provenance, actually, when we have the community participating in it, because we get a lot more context, we get a lot more usefulness. We also get a lot more understanding about what was going on, which was particularly important right now for a lot of us in Canada when we're talking about residential school records, just because a lot of people are trying to make sense of that experience and really document well what happened there. It also, too, the important things with description is what that point was when we were talking about decolonial provenance, is we're rebalancing the power, we're changing the dynamic. So we're removing archivists as the people who decide, you know, not only how they're arranged or who gets to be the creator, or what these archives mean, what is their context, but we're also removing the archivist as the people who decide what the title of a photo should be, what it is that they're seeing and interpreting through their lens. Because a lot of times when we're reading correspondence and naming things at the file level, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that kind of stuff, you're interpreting what you're reading through your lens. Whereas, if somebody is more familiar with these collections or with these documents and they're reading it, they might get a different title or a different descriptor or some other type of information that should be tagged onto that record. So there are many forms of that. There's digital redescription. So we actually did something very interesting where we got survivor approval to post some of the athletic pictures from the Shingwak Residential School on the Facebook page. And we actually had community members in the comments leaving, context about what was going on, who was in the photo, people identifying family members, things like that. And so what all of this community participation and Indigenous-led redescription does is it goes beyond reparative description by a non-Indigenous archivist. It creates authenticity in the archives and dismantles power, which I think is really important to decolonial archival practice.
I think that kind of leads into access. And I think the reason why we're looking at provenance and description is to get to access, at least in my mind. That's kind of the reasoning behind it. But that being said, not everything should be accessible, particularly to everyone. There's cultural protocols that need to be followed depending on the type of material. And I think this is where we go back to need to talk to community, need to understand that a white archivist cannot be making cultural decisions or cultural protocol decisions on who should be accessing materials. So I think part of this is understanding what's in your collection is part of a good place to start. We've talked to a number of different groups, and one of the common questions or comments that comes back is there's nothing in my museum, my archives, my heritage house or heritage site that is related to Indigenous people. And I would often counter back, do you know everything that's in your collection? Have you also thought about where you're located? Have you thought about the land that you're on? Thought about the people that currently live in your community? There's many different ways to look at your collection. And I think understanding what is there is really important. But beyond that, I think access, one of the things at the Shingwak Residential School Center we've been doing is thinking about access permissions, access restrictions, and what access online and access in person looks like, because they're very different things. And that might mean setting up different protocols for viewing, be that using a database that allows different levels of privacy, but also are there certain protocols that if in person, only certain people can view them, certain times of year, things like that need to be taken into consideration. Skylee?
Yeah, and I think too, another big thing is storing ceremonial items properly. So in some cases, when you're looking at ethnographic collections, anthropology collections, I was in my master's at a museum that was based on archaeology, and a lot of those items were problematic in themselves. And what was being done was this critical review and also this proactive disclosure, which I think is very important in archives. Is we spend a lot of time, going through the backlog, making sure everything is updated, looking through databases, doing research requests. But, when we really go through our collections and we find something, that could be relevant to an Indigenous community, I think it is a great practice to have that allyship to notify communities that there are items in your archives, not wait for them to reach out to you. And also, make solutions available, whether that be digital repatriation or full repatriation. setting up some type of viewing, digitizing files and sending them over. There's all kinds of ways that archives can bring allyship or bring the foundation of trust in a relationship with a community. And I think that, you know, setting up a database for culturally appropriate access, that's definitely something that we're seeing communities do on the grassroots level, the community level. And it's very complicated. I'm not a programmer, but I've seen some of the back end, and it's very complex. And I think that it's something, you know, that eventually we'll have to get ready for. The other thing too is there's a lot of talk about current contemporary data and, you know, Indigenous data sovereignty and things like that, but people aren't thinking of data about Indigenous people in the archives. They're not thinking about cultural data or data as sacred, data as, you know, knowledge transfer and cultural identity. And I think especially in the era of AI, in the era of people taking photographs off of a digitized archive and using them in publications to actually argue against causes of Indigenous people, I think we have to be a lot more conscious as archivists about what we put out as public facing and fully accessible. While I think survivors, communities, Indigenous people should have full access to information that is about them and about their family, about their community, about their history, I don't think that necessarily the entire world should have access to absolutely everything. Because we're seeing AI creating art based off of traditional art. We're seeing it compiling, you know, real and invented information about ceremonies, about peoples, in a way that is very convincing because it's taking it from bits and pieces scraped across the internet. So I think we have to be a lot more conscious about decolonial access and what that means, and seeing it as more of like a negotiated and ongoing relationship between archives and Indigenous people and communities.
Yeah, I'd say kind of to add on to that, at the Shingwak Residential School Center, we recently looked at our access policies again, particularly around granting use of residential school photos for publication. And part of this has come from seeing a rise in residential school denialism and folks repurposing archival documents and photographs, taking them out of context and using them to argue that residential schools did not exist, were fake news, or were not that bad. And so on the archival side, being very clear around what images we're sharing, but also how they can be used as much as we can, realizing that the internet is a thing and people can right click and copy or screenshot stuff. But yeah, I think trying to work through that in an ethical way that is Indigenous-led is really important as well. So I think we are actually going to leave it there. But if there's questions, we're happy to have a conversation and chat a little bit more about specific areas that we touched on today.
Great presentation and talk, Krista and Skylee-Storm. We appreciate you. We are now opening the Q&A part of the program. You can click on the bottom for any questions. We also have the chat still open for discussion as well.
Thank you all. Oops, sorry. I think volume. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, we're having a watch party over here in Cafe Central Victoria. I'm hiding. So I do see a question from our very own Katrina Femlin in the chat, and we can for sure take the cafe prerogative over here. Katrina, do you want to ask your own question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I had typed it into the chat on the assumption that I would have to leave to get home So I was planning on not being able to ask it out loud, but I'll ask it out loud, and it's also written there. So thanks so much for this talk. I'm currently one of the co-directors of our MLIS program, and I'm also, I teach both master's level and undergraduate courses on digital curation, many of which involve community-based projects of different kinds. I've been thinking a lot about how we can improve our curriculum to prepare students for work within communities, work in really successful and effective and equitable community institutional partnerships. And your talk has given me a lot of inspiration, but I guess I'm just wondering, what do you see as the top priorities for how we improve our MLIS curricula for preparing students for this kind of work?
I think a good place to start is looking at Indigenous librarians, Indigenous information professionals, what they're doing. There is a lot of work being done internationally about Indigenous information. So, you know, the CARE principles are this addition with the FAIR principles. So collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And then FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So bringing in some more of those considerations and guest speakers, you know, readings from Indigenous information professionals or people who are in close and practical and active partnership with those folks. I think that those are good places to start, just to kind of expand people's knowledge, as well as like their sensitivity to maybe other ways of doing things. I think a lot of people learn like one method or two methods, and they're like kind of like the accepted North American standard of what you should do, or the accepted Western standard. And there's this fear of abandoning the guidelines that I've seen so often, of like, oh no, what's going to happen to the documents? What's going to happen to the books? What's going to happen to the collection if we, you know, expand this policy or change the way we control and the way we access things? So it's really, if, you know, the earlier you expose people to different ways of thinking and different ways of approaching how to do this work, I think that that's gonna maybe make more open-minded information management professionals in the future, just because they've seen alternate ways of doing it and the library is still there, or the archives is still there. It didn't like disappear. So I think that that's like a really important thing.
Like are a ton of great community library and community archive models out there. When I am teaching, I tend to draw on examples, and if possible, like Skylee said, either guest speaker, or if you can do a site visit. Like, I think those are options that can really get people thinking about different ways they can approach community work.
Awesome. Thank you all. And just for the sake of the record, when we share this recording, I'll read out some of the questions in the chat, and we'll trot through those, or I should say in the Q&A, so folks still keep those wonderful questions coming. We have a question from Brittany who says, thank you so much for your talk. I'm interested in how policy creation, for example, use rights, is done with the community or other archives you're connected to.
So, complicated answer from the Shingwak Residential School Center side. And that's partially because of how the center is organized. It is governed by a MOU between the Children of Shingwak Alumni Association, so that survivor group, and Algoma University, which is the university that now sits on that residential school site. And so policies are made jointly, primarily through staff participation with the survivor group. So survivor group is driving the policy, they're the ones approving it, but that lift, or maybe that expertise that around archives specifically, that's usually coming from staff.
Okay, great. We have an anonymous question. Thank you for your fantastic presentation. You mentioned reparative description could be a decolonizing method. How would you account for the common fear that there would be too many descriptive subject terms to describe an archival item, causing confusion as to which should be used?
I think, when you're coming up with a description, so we have the archives I've worked with and the databases I've worked with, we've got, separate fields for a lot of things. There's the title of the file. There's date information. There's in some cases, a short description of what is in the file. And then, there are things like tags, which are kind of like the metadata of what people could use search terms for or location information to garner a search result that would yield that file. So what I think is possible here is you can work with community, or you can work with somebody to make sure that the title and the description is what the community wants it to be, or what, as close as you can get to the proper information for what somebody wants that to be in the description, that reparative. And also you can, keep the old description, square brackets in, the notes section, but you can also add as much metadata as you want. And oftentimes that isn't always viewable by the searcher, by the researcher, by the user. Those are really things that will just help return a result. So you can always embed extra information in there just to make it more useful. It really just depends on your CMS, and your database and how it looks and how it functions. That's going to be different, I think, for everyone. I don't know if you have something to add, Krista.
Well, I was thinking it more from the angle of incorporating either cultural terms or language terms, and how having other options I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, even if it means a single item has a ton of subject terms. I think that actually gives more access points, which I don't think is a bad scenario.
I think, and this may connect to a question from Selena, who writes, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about community relationships when the Indigenous community in question is part of a broader cultural group that may not see description and access the same? How do you acknowledge those differing voices without creating barriers to those involved?
So the Shingwak Residential School impacted 85 First Nations, and those are all not from the same cultural group. So they're Cree folks, Anishinaabe folks, OG Cree folks, Inuit folks, Haudenosaunee folks that all attended Shingwak. And the Children of Shingwak Alumni Association uses a consensus building decision-making model. And so be it we're talking about description, we're talking about accessions, we're talking about access protocols, it is all done through conversation and dialogue. But that's just the model that the Children of Shingwak Alumni Association use. There's lots of other models out there.
Yeah, and I should add that that is something that I'm hearing from different communities across Canada. Also, we have the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Archives, who is having difficulties, deciding how to share information, because there's so many different communities that could be implicated in one set of records when we're talking about the Canadian context. And I know even some from the American context with boarding schools, they take in people from a variety of areas, or landmass areas have, several different tribal nations living together in kind of like one area. We have something similar in Canada. In Ontario, there's the Six Nations of the Grand River. There's actually a few different distinct cultural communities that live within one reserved territory. So it comes from years of dialogues, how people want to do protocols, how people want to negotiate access and description and information sharing. It's not easy work. I think that's the key part there, is it's not going to be something that's you know, we got a 6-month engagement grant plan and we're going to get it done. It's like, no, this is going to take several years. The only reason why the SRC is at where it's at right now is because this started in the early 1980s. So it took decades of work to get to this point. So it's going to probably take decades of work to negotiate complex information sharing between Indigenous nations, that's for sure.
I think we sort of have time for one more, so I'm going to combine, I think, a thread that I see in a longer question in the chat and 2 questions, which are really about taking some of the learnings from the methodologies and the insights from your book. And I think folks are hungry for ideas for how to apply this more broadly. So somebody's touching on, I think, music collections in Detroit, Chinese immigrant stories from the 19th century. Do you have advice for other folks who are considering how to apply these ideas elsewhere?
I mean, I think a lot of these have in common that it's community archiving work or working with communities. And so I think there are shared principles of that relationship building, that time and effort, acknowledging the labor of community folks that can apply in many different circumstances. In terms of things like reparative description or different types of provenance, I think those can exist in different contexts too. And you see some of that in both public history work, but also in community archives work more broadly. If you look at the community archives literature from the UK, for example. But yeah, Skylee, do additional pieces?
I think, you know, it comes back to the earlier piece of seeing the archives as something living that connects you know, communities, especially marginalized communities or communities living in a diaspora, to their ancestors or to the people who you know, brought their families to another place. I think, you know, even in Indigenous contexts, you have a lot of youth who don't know the history of a community or of their families or how to use an archive. I think the emotions, though, are there. I think that you know, bringing those things together beyond metadata, but then also incorporating it somehow, I think that those are going to come organically based off of community need and how the community is interacting with the archives, what the purpose of the archives is, whether or not that's meeting our quote unquote standard definition of an archive. Because I can think of things like the Black Archive started in Atlanta, Georgia. I can think of the Black Archives Collective here in Canada, where it's really like that grassroots community piece. It might be digital, it might be people bringing in things together. In Ganawage, they have a photo project that's going on right now. They're creating a massive photo archive where they're encouraging families to bring in their photos, have them digitized, and they can either be kept at the cultural center or they can be brought back home. And I think that, you know, seeing those things interact and seeing people being able to use those things, yeah, crowdsourcing themes, exactly. Like these things can be grassroots, and archives doesn't have to just be at a university or be at a government of some type. It can be at a variety of different places, and it can look like a variety of different things. What matters is you're bringing together the history of a community together with those people or with their descendants, and making the archive something tangible and real and connected. I think that's how you reconcile metadata with feelings and personal reflections and lived experiences. But yeah, before we wrap up though, I wanted to say, like, some of these questions and some of these reflections were really amazing. Some of the work that people are working on here sounds awesome, and I'm very interested in looking up a few of these things to learn more about what you're doing.
Great. Well, we're right at 5 o'clock. Thank you all. I don't know. I think there may be a few other questions and chats coming in, so we can stay on for another moment. But if our speakers or anybody else has to run, of course, please do. But please join us in thanking our speakers today, and we'll be sharing the recording on the Center for Archival Futures website in due course. Thank you so much. Golf class. Okay.
Does it echo if I talk?
I will.
And I think Lydia popped off, but I wanted to thank Lydia because Lydia, I think, found out if this book was coming out before any of us and got it on the radar. And I think we've been anxious to have you both come speak for a year or something like that. I think it's been on our radar for a long time. So we're just so glad we got it. And as I think Selena mentioned in the chat, I haven't been able to shut up about this book. And we had 80 people here plus another 200 registered. So I think there'll be lots more people spreading the word about the book and about the work you guys are doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a great chat.
I couldn't hear anything for a second.
We do have a hand up in the attendee list.
Okay. Let me see if I can see the hand. Can I see the hand? Can the person unmute, or do we need to?
Oh, they just popped it in the chat. The book is called Decolonial Archival Futures.
Okay. All right. And if that person wants to hang on, I can put the link for the book into the chat as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I needed. Oh, if you could put the link in the chat, that would be great. You could put the link in the chat. Oh, there it is. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yes, we did have one question we didn't get to, and I will put it over into the chat if that is helpful, and if our attendee happens still to be here, but not to worry at all if folks have to run. I think I've got this. And thank you, everybody, for your great questions. Can you see that?
There we go. Now I can say hi.
It's not to say that we think that archivists should be removed. It's more so not, it's not centering their opinion as the rule of law, or like the only thing that's official or that matters, or the only accurate answer. You know, archival knowledge is specialized. There's a lot of conservation. There's a lot of value to knowing how to put things together and make them searchable and usable. What we're saying is that it should just be done with different people in mind instead of the ones that are always traditionally prioritized and thought of within the archives, especially when we're thinking of Indigenous people, because their information and their materials are often alienated from them, so they're not actually described and arranged appropriately, if to sum it up.
All right, thank you for that question and for staying on the line to hear the answer. And again, Skylee-Storm, Krista, thank you so much. And we will let you go back to your lives and
mayhem.
Yeah, we will all be excitedly buying and distributing copies of the book for years to come, I think. All right. Thanks, everyone.